Good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Sanjeev Gupta. I'm a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. I would like to welcome you to our webinar on political economy of tax reforms in developing countries. We all recognize how important it is for developing countries to mobilize more resources domestically to be able to fund the sustainable development goals. Indeed, the work done at the IMF has shown that at the minimum, low-income developing countries will need an average of 5% of GDP of additional revenue by 2030 to cover the cost of SDGs in just 5 key areas. The amount required by countries in sub-Saharan Africa is larger because their baseline is lower than the average low-income developing country. While their tax to GDP ratio has grown by 3 to 4 percentage points in low-income countries in the past 20 years or so, the growth in this ratio appears to be slowing down. Based on estimates of tax buoyancy in sub-Saharan Africa, it appears that growth in tax revenue would be insufficient to meet the needs of the SDGs. We all know the changes in tax policy and tax administration that are needed to expand the tax base in developing countries, but it is not always feasible to implement the desired reforms because of political considerations. And this is precisely what we are going to discuss today. The key questions are, what are the key political aspects that have impeded tax reforms in low-income developing countries? Is it because of perceptions about the impact on the poor? What kind of tax reforms are more likely in these countries? Do tax reforms worsen income distribution? And would the advent of COVID propel these countries to institute tax reforms because their revenue position has been hurt more than that of advanced economies? So in this webinar, we'll start with a short presentation by Professor Zalis, which is based on papers prepared at CGD in the past 1 year. Zhao is currently an assistant professor at the University of Lisbon and is one of the most widely published economists at his age. He has previously worked at the IMF, ECB, OECD, and has taught at different universities in Europe. Let me also take this opportunity to introduce our distinguished panelists who are involved in policymaking at the international institutions and at the country level. Let me start with Catherine. Catherine Bayer is an assistant director at the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, overseeing IMF's capacity development efforts in taxation in 80 countries in Africa and Latin America. She has previously worked at the US Treasury and for government of Mexico. Chiara is currently a practice manager at the World Bank for Fiscal Policy and Sustainable Growth Unit, and has worked for virtually all the international organizations, such as Asian Development Banks, IMF, OECD, and the UN. And she has also worked for the UK government. Elliot is currently UN's Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development, as well as its chief economist. He has previously worked at the IMF in different capacities, and we both did a very challenging mission to Ukraine at the peak of winter without any heat some years ago. So that's another qualification he has. And Ya Ansu is currently Senior Policy Advisor to Ghana's Minister of Finance, and has held many senior positions at the World Bank, including that of a country director. He was also the chief economist for the African Center for Economic Transformation for 7 years. Now, let me just lay out some rules for the audience. If you have any questions, please submit them at events@cgdev.org or tweet at cgdev #CGDtalks, or submit your comments via YouTube. Now, let me request Zhao to start his short presentation. You have about 12 minutes, and then he will just lay out some of the key issues. Thank you, Zhao.
Okay, thank you very much, Sanjeev, the panelists and the audience for having me in this webinar. I will share my screen now. So, okay, I hope you're saying it correctly. As Sanjeev was pointing out, this is work that we have conducted in the past year and led to three related research papers on tax reforms in developing countries. We know, as Sanjeev rightly pointed out, that low-income developing countries need resources for financing development needs. And so revenue mobilization at the domestic level is key to achieving that goal. In the context of the very demanding 17 SDGs and 10 years left in the horizon to do them, this is a critical aspect for developing countries to have in mind. It's also critical domestically to have more revenues to ensure long-run debt sustainability and also improve the financing allocation of funds and depend less from grants and donors and more from domestic resources. We know that from the two set of stylized fact charts that I have in this slide, that developing countries have made significant progress in raising revenues. For instance, the average tax to GDP ratio in low-income developing countries increased from about 10 percentage points of GDP in the early 2000s to about 14% in about 20 years' time. But still, this is not enough to meet the SDGs. And there is, of course, a great deal of heterogeneity between income groups and also between different regions of the low-income developing set of countries. You can see that in the right-hand side chart, Sub-Saharan Africa is somehow lagging behind some of the other regions, in particular Latin America and emerging and developing Asia. We know that there are several obstacles to conduct reforms, not specifically fiscal policy related reforms. And typically, there is a huge literature that elaborates on the political economy aspects of these blockade and set of vested interests that sometimes we see in many developing countries, groups of corporations or agents individually that are able to opt out of the tax system. And this, of course, affects the general perception of the public and in terms of the overall tax compliance as the population becomes less and less convinced that the benefits of paying taxes will be materialized in social expenditure for the common good. So we know that the resistance from these vested interests is in many circumstances and instances impairing the implementation of needed tax reforms to raise more revenue. And one example is the set of tax exemptions that many governments in these set of countries tend to implement as a policy action. So the need for more revenues in these countries to support their developmental needs calls for undertaking a set of critical fiscal reforms, and notably in the tax area, not only individual tax instruments in terms of increasing the tax base or making their tax rates internationally more competitive and attractive, but also in terms of revenue administration and how they manage resources. So the idea behind my presentation and the work that I did jointly with Sanjeev is that we have several political economy aspects that can be important drivers to explain the likelihood of basically moving forward or not with certain types of reforms. One aspect is clearly ideology of the ruling government. And of course, in this case, there's a literature that says that left-wing governments may not prefer to undertake certain types of reforms in PIT, in personal income tax, for instance, because of the fear of the benefit that will benefit a certain elite or top group of richer constituents. So there's also the risk that if you have to operate in a government that is fragmented politically with a lot of divisions and ability to veto certain policies, then there is a tendency to preserve the status quo in terms of fiscal matters, so not to advance and move forward with necessary tax reforms. At the same time, elections, so political timing of elections seems to be an important driver, and especially when you have incumbent governments playing the different tax and spending policies to try to win elections. This research that we've conducted is based to analyze these considerations and what extent these political aspects have affected the implementation of tax reforms in developing countries, both emerging markets and low-income developing countries. And we have used a so-called new narrative-based approach that was put together by colleagues at the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department that collected data on 45 developing countries over a 15-year horizon. And this database considers basically very large tax revenue changes at the aggregate, but also discriminates by type of policy instrument and also revenue administration and its different components or areas within revenue administration. This is an important aspect because we want to focus on major reforms or major shocks. From the technical or econometric level, it's important because of identification aspects. And so the precise timing of key legislative tax actions that took place over this time period is important. And of course, we are looking at only reforms that were revenue enhancing. Okay, so for the data set includes a set of minor policy actions that together with others in a basket of policies may have decreased tax revenue, but we don't consider those. In terms of stylized facts, the vast majority of tax reforms in these countries were in the area of goods and services. This is not surprising, especially in many countries, VAT was in existence or very, very small as a share of their contribution to tax revenue. So it was easier to work with this policy instrument. You can see from the table a list of the set of country years of tax reforms by type and by income group. So out of the 45 countries, we have 23 emerging markets, 22 low income, so pretty much half of the sample in each income group. But as I said, most of the reforms over these 15-year horizon took place in goods and services. Emerging markets did a little bit more reform on PIT, on personal income and excises, while low income, if you want to split the two income groups, did a bit more on trade taxes. So this is just a set of stylized facts that come directly from analyzing the database on which we use to do our empirical or applied research. To summarize our findings, we basically find that left-wing governments tend to be less inclined to implement tax reforms using a set of binary choice models, and then proximity to elections and also political cohesion in the government are positively correlated with the implementation of those needed tax policy reforms. It seems, and this is our reading of the findings, that left-leaning governments are more distrustful of tax reforms, presumably because of the perception that these set of reforms may benefit more the rich. And then there's also the fact that this reform hindering effect of left ideology seems to be stronger in low-income countries vis-a-vis emerging market economies. Revenue administration reforms are resisted across the board by most left-leaning governments, and proximity to elections seem to trigger more reforms in the PIT or personal income tax area, as opposed to trade reform, possibly reflecting the fear that small businesses may become worse off in the process. Notwithstanding, what we see is that the absence of a fragmented government, so strong governments or strong coalitions ruling and implementing this set of reforms is a key and necessary ingredient for this set of reforms to move forward in all areas that is applied to tax reform. Relatedly, in another paper that we wrote over the past year, what we saw that irrespectively of whether there are political considerations to bear in mind in implementing reforms, some are easier and some are harder to implement. Some improve income distribution. And what we see here are basically a set of results or impulse response functions conducted at the panel level on the effects of these reforms on two measures of income distribution, so the Gini index and the bottom income share. And so we find that this perception that reforms benefit the rich can actually be misplaced. And so when reforms include personal income tax and revenue administration aspects, the disposable Gini index tends to fall and poor's income tends to rise. Okay, and these effects are generally statistically significant at usual levels. What is perhaps more worrisome is that our general finding is largely driven by countries outside the sub-Saharan African group, suggesting that the design of tax reforms in this area or this region of the world has been more ineffective compared to other regions. And so one has to pay a closer attention to this result. What you also find is that the size of government, either measured by the tax expenditure to GDP ratio or the amount of revenues that the government is able to collect, have a different effect on how tax reforms affect income distribution. Typically, the smaller the government and the smaller the tax system, the larger the beneficial impact of these tax reforms, because the marginal cost of new taxes when you start from zero or very low levels is relatively small. The marginal benefit of additional spending, specifically when you have already a large expenditure to GDP ratio, is relatively high. Okay, so this is what we also find and conjecture. Finally, we looked in another study whether the advent of COVID in the current juncture could induce a faster pace of implementation of these tax reforms. What we find by looking at a set of pandemics over the past 20 years is that not only pandemics can actually propel this set of reforms. Of course, COVID has affected economic and disrupted economic and production systems worldwide and affected revenue position in many developed and developing countries. But our research finds that countries are more likely to implement tax reforms to deal with the challenges arising from pandemics, particularly the areas of CIT, excises, and property in the aftermath of a pandemic event, which is typically comes in parallel with social and economic distress. Of course, this set of pandemic-led reform comes along the same lines as the famous crisis-led reform hypothesis of Drazen and Greeley, and this is basically the fact that there is a new momentum that leads governments to perhaps put some differences aside and work together towards the recovery and do the necessary set of reforms to get out of the slump. Unfortunately, pandemics do not drive these countries to implement revenue administration reforms, which under different areas, IT, human resources, compliance, are in many instances quite needed. Our last slide is what can we draw from our work? First and foremost, that increasing tax revenues is an ambitious and complex task that depends upon several factors. Here, the focus has been more on political economy aspects. There is, of course, in terms of our findings, a great potential to capture more revenues in better ways and design them in better ways to have the capacity to put them at work and to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. However, there are different perceptions of policymakers about the impact on poor strata of the population, and the strength of political players in the decision making is probably impeding certain types of reforms to move forward. Our analysis also shows that this may not be necessarily the case everywhere, because properly designed tax reforms can indeed benefit the poor, decrease the Gini inequality index, increase the set of lower bottom quintiles or quartiles of the distribution of income for developing countries. And actually the current momentum of pandemic that we are living, based on research from past pandemics like Zika, Ebola, SARS, and others, suggests that maybe the right opportunity and the right timing to move forward with long delayed reforms that are necessary to meet those development goals in the near and longer term for these countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zhao. If you could please remove the PowerPoint from the screen so that we can see. Yeah, thank you so much. Let me now invite Catherine to react to this presentation. And so I would appreciate if each panelist could limit their initial remarks to 7 minutes so as to give us time for questions from the audience. So Catherine, could you please reflect on your experience regarding tax reforms in the two regions that you oversee, Sub-Saharan Africa and Western Hemisphere countries? What have been the key political bottlenecks to reforms in these two regions? And how did you take these considerations into account in giving your advice? Catherine.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. And I just want to say thank you for having me at this event. It's a pleasure to be able to comment also on Joao's and your very interesting presentation and research. Let me say that when I started putting this list together of major political economy considerations hindering tax reform for the two regions, I found that there were a lot of points that were similar. So perhaps some general points that I think are applicable or relevant for both regions, including because there's such a variety of different types of countries including the level of development between the regions and within the regions as well. I think one of the aspects that Joao alluded to, but that I would highlight, is the idea of lack of continuity of government. In other words, when you have changes from one government to the next, so it's not only the fragmentation that is referred to, but also drastic changes from one government period to the next in terms of the view of the tax system reform and what the objectives should be. I think for tax system reform, we need long periods to design and also to really help implement, have the tax administration and the customs administration. It's also an important actor, sometimes the social insurance contribution administration, implement these changes. So if you have lack of continuity of government across 8, 12, 16 years of very, very drastic changes in policy, that doesn't help matters. Definitely the behind the scenes negotiations that lead to tax exemptions are one of the major political considerations to tax reform. And also the fact that there's this fundamental faith in the power of tax exemptions to attract foreign direct investment. And that's a very difficult one, I think, even with data to counter. But when you ask what did we do, what have we done, is really to try and present some evidence to the effect showing that that's not necessarily the case, that this perceived link between exemptions and foreign direct investment and growth is not necessarily that strong. Another hindrance is the lack of connection between the executive and the legislative branch, where the legislative branch of government is often not that well informed regarding tax policy issues, especially in the lower income countries, the lowest income countries. And there, what we've tried to do is reach out more to fiscal commissions in the legislative branch of governments to explain the rationale behind some of the tax policy proposals, and also just to hear from them what the issues are and why they would oppose such reforms. So having that dialogue. That would extend to another obstacle that we see, which is the weak culture of civil society engagement and channels for influencing tax policy design and performance of the revenue agencies, which is something you see more in more developed countries. So there's the lack of a sense by civil society that they're represented in these tax reform initiatives. Again, I think that what the IMF and other, in conjunction with other organizations working on these issues in the countries have tried to do more actively is reach out to civil society groups much more actively regarding the issues the objectives that we're trying to reach through tax reform. And finally, I have to talk about the countries that are heavily reliant on natural resources. One big, I think, political obstacle is very much the existence of a kind of a state within the state in those countries, where usually in national gas or oil companies' accounts are not transparent, and they don't necessarily pay tax, or if they do so in a very non-transparent way. For example, by presenting consolidated tax returns when there are many taxpayers involved in a certain sector. So what we're doing there is also working with the country authorities to try and lay out what are the minimum requirements for good tax compliance and tax transparency and accountability by all taxpayers, including national extractive industry, national oil companies, and related. So really trying to go back and highlight those basic requirements and bring those companies into the compliance circle, if you will. So just in a nutshell, I have other points to make, Sanjeev, but those were some that I wanted to highlight, and of course come back to some of Joao's points that I was jotting down and having some reactions to as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for very interesting additional points to what Joao had said. And so I would now turn to Elliot, because Elliot sits in a global sort of institution, and it can get into some of the political issues a lot more than the bank and the fund can. And so I would like to seek his views on what is Yuan's experience on the tax reforms, and how can the political bottlenecks that Zhao and Catherine talked about, how would you suggest from the Yuan's perspective they be dealt with? Elliot.
Thank you, Sanjeev. It's amazing how, despite a year of doing this online stuff, we still forget to unmute before we start to talk and make ourselves look really silly. Thank you for that. And Zhao, thank you for the presentation. It was excellent. I enjoyed both papers. But I have to say that when I read the papers, I was expecting to see a treatment of some of the political economy aspects that might drive tax reform that are not purely domestic in nature, but that are international. And from our perspective in the UN, I think that is one of the major issues that we think about. I want to try to separate that into two sort of buckets. On the one hand, you have the various international and regional commitments that governments make. We have the commitment to the SDGs, we have the commitment to the Paris Agreement, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. All of those would normally have implications for government policy in a broad sense, but also for fiscal policy. We have regional arrangements, many of them in trade, and they too will necessarily have an impact on how governments deal with some of their tax policy considerations. What we see here, and I have to point out that in many respects, when we talk about the SDGs in the context of tax reform, we're thinking almost exclusively about mobilizing revenue for the expenditures associated with the SDGs. But by the same token, tax policy is probably the single most impactful instrument of government policy. It drives incentives. And we do find that there is very little sense in developing countries, but also in the most sophisticated of countries, little sense that governments are thinking about their fiscal policies and their tax policies from an SDG perspective. Just one example is in terms of the Paris Agreement, we have all sorts of commitments, nationally determined contributions, for example, commitments to emissions reduction, but no corresponding adjustment of the fiscal regime to enable that. And it's fundamentally inconsistent. And consequently, such policies are very ineffective, if you will, in attracting the kinds of investment that developing countries in particular will need. And so we think that that is one area where tax reform has to explicitly take into account how these tax policies and the changes therein will strengthen or weaken efforts to reach the SDGs. But there's another area, and this is the area where the UN is far more active. It is that governments may very well be motivated in their domestic tax policy decisions by domestic conditions. But in their domestic tax policy decisions, what they actually implement, they have to take into account the international context. Many, many governments are constrained by existing tax treaties. And these are treaties that have been put in place decades ago. And they constrain the ability of governments to adjust their taxes to match the evolution of the structure of their economy. In particular, for example, when you think about taxing certain types of capital gains or taxing the digital economy, these are tax changes, tax reforms that are critically important to the evolving structure of a modern economy, be it developing or developed, but they have cross-border implications, and those cross-border implications are affected by the international treaties that are in place. Now, these treaties do depend on domestic tax policy, but then domestic tax policy depends on what treaties are in place. And one of the problems that we face with developing countries in particular is that they are not really fully represented in all of the networks that discuss these international norms that guide tax agreements. And they often fail or they don't have the full capacity to be able to negotiate to their own advantage in what is an increasingly complex set of tax rules, global tax rules, that reflect, in fact, the greater integration of the global economy. And this is something that we think is a major problem. We know that international norms can prevent countries from implementing domestically the tax policy priorities that they should have. And those priorities should depend on things like their administrative needs and capacities, their political objectives, their economic needs, and also their international commitments. But they don't have the full freedom of movement here. And this is something that we think is a major problem. We've seen a lot of effort and a lot of discussion around these issues in the past couple of years, and there's a greater sense of momentum here. But by the same token, I must say that governments in the developing world absolutely have to strengthen their administrative and tax policy capacities in order to be able to position themselves in this international framework, because that international framework is a major constraint on what governments can do within their own borders as far as tax policy is concerned, given the integration of economies across borders. And that's where a lot of the work of the UN centers. It's the work on taxes, I mean. What we're trying to encourage here is a multilateral approach to guidance, providing guidance on international tax matters, on tax treaties, and the link between international tax treaties and domestic tax law. And that's important on the one hand because international treaties don't create taxes. They merely preserve or change taxing rights that exist already in domestic law. So one of the things we've tried to do, for example, is to strengthen the manual that we have created that developing countries can use to improve their ability to negotiate tax treaties. We strengthen the capacity building work around that. We talk about the double taxation conventions, the important elements that frame the way developing countries can think about that. There's been a lot of guidance from the UN Committee on Tax Matters on issues such as carbon taxation, extractive industry taxation. And again, that shows that having a multilateral approach can sometimes buttress the positions taken by individual governments in dealing with these sectors, very many of which are sometimes dominated by multinational firms. We also have to try to see how we can build a system that is more flexible and more responsive to the ongoing rapid changes in the structure of the global economy and of the local economy. And nothing is more important here in this context, I think, than the process of digitalization. And the taxation of the digital economy is a tremendously complex issue, and an issue of primordial concern for the biggest economies on the planet. And it's very clear that low-income countries, developing countries, least developed countries, fragile countries, they're just simply not appropriately reflected or represented in these discussions around some of these major changes that will affect them all. So I think one of the main concerns that we have to generate here is first ensuring that there is an appropriate representation of their interests in these international tax matters, and then secondly, ensuring that countries have the capacity to represent their own interests in such discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elliot, by bringing in the issue of international constraints in domestic policy making. I think that's a very pertinent issue. Just to let you know and let the audience know, we have another webinar on March 23rd, which is looking at international taxation. So exactly the kind of issues you're talking about. So let me now turn to Chiara. Chiara, you've been involved in the World Bank for a long time, and World Bank has lending programs that seek to promote tax reforms in developing countries. And so the issue is, how successful has these programs been in promoting tax reforms? And most of the programs do have some kind of a conditionality, as do the IMF programs. It's not peculiar to the bank programs to promote reforms. So has this conditionality helped in overcoming political constraints? Chiara.
Thank you, Sanjeev, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the discussion and to share the World Bank perspective. I read the 3 papers with particular interest, and I think they remain extremely valuable contribution to this, and also in this particular time of the crisis. And the topic raised are definitely relevant for the work that we are also leading with the World Bank. And as you heard from the previous speakers, not in isolations, we are collaborating together. And yes, we have a large portfolio with amounts right now at 2.5 billion of undisbursed loans to help countries to strengthen revenues, domestic revenue mobilization, but also work on tax administration reforms, incentives mechanisms, tax expenditures, how to green the economies, and also carbon prices and green transformation. In addition to, international taxation and supporting countries on bilateral agreements, in particular, revising bilateral agreements. Now, let me say, first of all, Sanjeev, the words Joao findings and your paper's findings definitely, and also what Catherine said just earlier, does resonate with us as well, based on this extensive and long-term experience, personal and also the institution I represent. Tax reforms is a long-term engagement, is often 2 steps forwards and 1 step backwards. And it does require sort of a broad-based consensus. Catherine mentioned not just government's involvement and commitment, political commitment, but it's also from civil society, from citizens at large. And so coming to your question first, based on this and based on this context, conditionalities sometimes work and sometimes do not work. not work so effectively. Or when we talk about conditionalities, it may be working that legislation is passed, but then may not get implemented in the way we were thinking, at least as technical experts. But I'd like to raise 3 points on this, also linked to the findings. And when there are opportunities, I think what we have, at least I can think in my mind, based on my experience of a couple of experiences, mostly related, I think, to the early 20s, and Peru and Georgia come to mind, where we really saw tremendous opportunity for reforms, to real substantive reforms, and where there were major challenges or major changes, political changes, or when there are unprecedented circumstances such as the COVID-19 crisis. At that point, it creates a space to come together and to open opportunities for reforms. And to this, I would like to make 3 observations. Because on one hand, the COVID-19, obviously, it's a major crisis. It's been a disaster, it's been destructive. But at the same time, it opens up a silver lining, in our view, because it can give us a chance to deepen the dialogue in some cases. And why I'm saying this is because actually, based on our findings, in low-income countries, tax GDP ratios were already on a plateau before the crisis. So now countries are facing tax GDP ratios dropping, while also the growth of the economy is slowing down. And even if we expect a slight improvement, we don't expect revenue to increase at the same pace. And that is also based on experience of 2008 crisis, where we saw that it took over 8 years for some countries to reach the point where they were in terms of tax GDP ratios at the pre-crisis phase. So why do I say this? Because actually right now there is pressure on our member countries to find ways to improve revenue mobilization. And because they see that everybody had to do a fiscal expansionary policy in order to respond to the health crisis, the economic crisis, and now they also need to consider how to remain or to keep the country on a fiscal sustainable path, and what are the instruments. And so tax policy comes very much back into play. And we have been receiving requests lately from emerging economies that normally do not engage with the World Bank in this context, both in Latin America countries as well as in East Asia Pacific. And they're really coming to ask, okay, can you benchmark our tax system? What can we do to improve revenue mobilization? So I think this is one of those moments linked to the political economy where maybe there is an opening to deepen this dialogue and to bring these aspects together. It also is a moment to propose new sources of revenues and broaden the base, and therefore push for considerations about carbon pricing, green taxes, health taxes, and maybe also taxation of wealth. Maybe it sounds optimistic, but we really believe this could be one point. Another consideration that I want to bring to the attention, that maybe in this period, and we did not see it in previous crises, as Joao has indicated, is actually tax administration is also considered, at least based on our experience at country level. We see it in Central Africa, Eastern Africa, Southeast Asia. We've been approached by governments asking to help them to maintain tax administration continuity and basically to accelerate those reforms that were lingering before in terms of automation of the tax systems, digitalization of tax systems. We see this coming as a request, and partly obviously to respond to the fact of being able to operate from a distance. So I see this also as another opportunity that we should consider, and maybe it's a bit not aligned with the findings of the paper. I think that was, can COVID-19 induce government to implement tax reform in developing countries? I think there is also a tax administration reform opportunity here. And it's also an opportunity to be more creative. We find that in Uganda, for example, they've been experimenting with different ways of auditing, which is based on big data, also using drones, and so using different proxies of assessing wealth and income. And that seems to bear fruits. So there are also new opportunities with the digital transformation. And the third and final point that I want to make, which is definitely a major consideration, it's always been an important consideration for the World Bank, which is equity, but now it's becoming extremely topical and urgent, is the equity side. And this makes me link the point that Joao mentioned, but also Catherine, on how we bring together basically the tax collectors and the taxpayers. And we are also, the bank is also investing a lot in running some pilots to really understand in our support to tax reforms, how to contribute to building trust between taxpayers and tax collectors. And so we're running some pilots. One is in Georgia that was focused mostly on small, medium-sized enterprises. And there was very much a link of not understanding how the VAT system works, having a perception that the VAT system was unfair, like the findings that Joao presented today. And in some cases, it's really perceptions that need to be addressed through communication. It's not just technical solutions. But also we find that some of the solutions that we also World Bank propose are far too technical, and it's paramount to understand the country context. I stop here. I'm happy to share other points during our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate your perspective very much. Finally, let me turn now to Joao, who has a unique perspective on these issues, having worked both at the World Bank and advising the government of Ghana. Ghana has a relatively low tax to GDP ratio, and some of the issues that we've been talking about are there. And you've been in the midst of all this. So what considerations from your perspective have influenced tax reforms in Ghana? And what are the considerations which would then generate some consensus on moving forward in a country like Ghana? And to what extent the availability of oil revenues impacted the mobilization of non-resource domestic revenues in Ghana? And so I will, you have 7 minutes so that we can have last 15-20 minutes for general discussion. We are getting quite a few questions. So thank you. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Sanjeev, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this program. And I'd like to congratulate you and Wow for the excellent work that you're doing. Now, I'll confine my remarks to 3 points. The whole idea of tax reform, the definition, the political economy aspects, and maybe some specific comments on the papers. Now, on tax reform, I noticed that basically, at least from the papers that I read, and also from the discussions here, tax reform is almost taken to be synonymous with significant increasing in tax revenue, particularly tax rate to GDP ratio, which I guess is needed. Especially for a country like Ghana, we need to raise our domestic resource mobilization. But typically, when one thinks of tax reforms, there are other aspects to it in addition to raising revenue. Of course, the equity, you could reform your taxes without necessarily raising revenue, either to increase the equity aspects or to increase efficiency and the growth enhancing aspects of it. And so I find it a bit misleading. I think it would be better in this effort if you just be much more specific about reforms that raise revenue and not use the general terms tax reform. Now, on the political economy aspects, I think, again, what I read was is typically confined to the politicians and the policymakers. But I think at least from what I have observed in the past few years that I've worked in the ministry, and as you said, Sanjeev, we have a specific challenge of trying to raise our revenues from about 13, about 12.5% when we started. Now it's about 13, 14. And we want to take it to 12, around 20, to close to our peers. But it's been very difficult. We've used all kinds of consultants, the World Bank, McKinsey, IMF has come in, bilaterals have come in. It's been very, very difficult. And my sense is that, there's a number of actors in this milieu, apart from politicians. First, the tax officials themselves. We've found that sometimes, the laws are there, but what is collected is much less than what needs to be collected. And it's collusion between tax officials and big companies, domestic, multinational. And you especially have this when you have a situation where pays are too low, and there's a strong incentive to basically cut a deal with a company that owes a lot of taxes, and that's you get some in your pocket, and the companies get away with. Nobody wants to pay taxes. So there's that basically the incentive system in the tax administration, especially in situations where pays are low and the incentive to cheat are high. Then there's there's the tax officials and the large companies. Then there's also the citizens. Nobody likes to pay taxes. And there's a big part of it, regardless of the design of the tax system, and even you have an administration, if the willingness or the compliance of citizens, taxpayers are not there, it's going to be difficult. And the compliance only comes from what the citizens see how their money is spent. So to some extent, you can only distinguish, detach tax reform from expenditure stance of government only to a certain extent. In a very fundamental sense, they are linked. I'm much more encouraged to pay taxes if I know that my taxes are being used to benefits me. And unless I see that, there'll be every incentive for me to cheat. I won't voluntarily step up to pay the taxes. So that is also very important. It's a very important political consideration, probably as big as focusing on the politicians, if not more. And then there's also the whole idea of investors, donors, international commitment, as our colleague from the UN has mentioned. Donors, the World Bank included, everybody don't want to pay taxes on their project, on imports on the projects, right? And these are important people that the government, if the World Bank is bringing me hundreds of billions of dollars for a project and they insist on tax exemption for imports, I'm much more likely to give in, right? So it's not only the private investors, and then investors. We always tell companies, look, tax exemptions, and they say you're giving away the shop and everything. But if I'm sitting in a country like Ghana, where there's a huge youth unemployment rate, only about less than 10% of people that are coming out of the tertiary and secondary sectors get formal sector jobs, and an investor comes in and is going to create a job that maybe in over 2 or 3 years is going to create 1,000+ jobs. That's a very strong incentives if I'm willing to increase employment, youth employment, to give the tax incentives regardless of what the theory says, right? So there is that into, and then of course you and Guy have talked about the project. So that's the political. It's much more that it's much more mixture and much more complicated than a simple policymaker political incentive in the literature will tell you. Now, in terms of the specifics on your paper, I have other things, but very quickly. In the first paper about proximity to elections, I found the definition a bit confusing. When you hear about proximity, it's just the closer to elections, but in the paper, it just says how long the chief executive has been in. So at the end, I came out very confused, don't know exactly what that proximity variable is measuring. But besides that, one thing, another aspect that I may suggest, you may want to consider maybe further work is that I think for a politician, the much more important, no politician, left wing or right wing, want to go and tell their constituents that they want to raise their taxes. But the incentives are very different if the government is in its first term or the second and last term. If they don't have to run it, I mean, the president doesn't have to run for election again. The incentives are very different from if they're in the first term and they're looking to run again for the second term. And so maybe in your next time, I mean, that distinction wasn't made in your proximity variable. So you might want to consider that. I think that probably is a much more important consideration than how long they've been in there or how close they are to elections. I also found the the use of the ideology left wing rather confusing and very mysterious. First, it wasn't really, I mean, I know you took it from some kind of a thing, it wasn't clearly defined. I really wasn't sure what is a left wing, what it was. And I also found that a bit satisfying that there wasn't a symmetric treatment for the various two classes of ideologies, left wing, right wing versus neutral. I mean, why you came to basically just what left wing as a variable analysis, I'm not quite sure. I mean, one can see many situations where left-wing government may want to increase taxes because, particularly in in resource-rich countries where you want to suck it to the big corporations from the outside. So that argument I didn't quite. First, it was a bit not quite well developed, and I didn't find convincing. Lastly, the paper on inequality and tax, and particularly the finding that in Sub-Saharan Africa, inequality, tax reform, actually significant increases in taxes were not associated with decreasing inequality. First thing, conceptually, tax reform can go anywhere. It can increase, decrease, or remain neutral with respect to inequality. The fact that what you found out in your sample, on the average, significant increases in taxes didn't reform in inequality is good. But in Sub-Saharan Africa, that wasn't the case. That brings to mind, especially the fact that I made earlier, that you cannot detach too much taxes from expenditure. Take Ghana, for example. Over the past 2 years, we've moved into a situation where we have free high school education, which for a country of Ghana's income level is huge, right? So even if you have a situation where you had significant increases in taxes and the taxes are not inequality reducing, and even if they are increasing inequality, to make a normative statement of that without taking into account what the increased tax resources were used and how that they were much more in favor for the poor or not, is a bit misleading. So my last point is that maybe in subsequent work, you need to really look at the design of what's perspective. I mean, all you did was break it into the various tax handles, personal income tax, corporate income tax, and other. Look at the specific design of what the reforms were, and maybe also to some extent important social programs that are taking place within the period that you're looking at of that significant tax increase to see to what extent. And then you had a much more comprehensive and maybe a more balanced view. Quality. I think I ended.
Thank you, on some of the points that you've made. I think Zhao can respond to them quite easily, but I like the point that you made about the tax exemptions to donors, on which CGD has been writing a lot. The amount of revenue lost in some countries can be as much as 3% of GDP, depending on how reliant the country is on foreign aid. So, and I think you're totally right that tax reforms have to be linked to the spending programs, and that issue is taken into account in the papers. But anyway, that's for Zhao to respond, not for me. But let me now turn to Zhao to respond just 2 minutes to some of the points which different panelists have raised. After which I have quite a few questions which audience has put forward, which I will then throw out. But I will give Zhao first 2-3 minutes to respond, and then I will put forward some of the questions which have come from the audience. Zhao.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. Thank you all for discussants, for comments on our papers and general remarks. Without any specific order, I will highlight some issues. The issue of resource-rich economies, of course, is important, and we highlight and separate this set of countries in our research work specifically for this reason. They have different, of course, different alignment of incentives, and perhaps they do not go as strongly towards the reform momentum as they should, because they rely when the headwinds, when winds are good and favorable, they just receive revenue without doing anything. So that's a separate group, but I mean it's not it's a minority out of all developing countries. Then there is the issue that was quite transversal to some comments of the importance of digitalization. And before I left the fund, I was part of the fiscal monitor that dealt with fiscal policy and digitalization. And this is, of course, perhaps too soon and too recent to have sufficient data to work with some certainty empirically on some outcomes, because there are, of course, different proxies of digitalization and digital government and what to do about it. But the data is still a bit scarce in time and coverage and quality. But it's certainly an aspect that is important, especially at the revenue administration front. Catherine mentioned customs, and I mean, there was a section there on trade fraud, and I think Yaw mentioned collusion and corruption of officials, and at the border, that's specifically in many instances a problem. And of course, digitalization, filing, and e-filing, and other aspects of IT are certainly important in increasing efficiency and withdrawing incentives to act in a certain corrupted or perversive way. Then, of course, there is the transversal aspect that Elliot mentioned about international cooperation, tax treaties, and so on and so forth. It is an important point. Some countries are have stronger bounds to respect some international legal aspects than others, and of course, the level playing field is not everywhere, and for countries domestically to have levers of maneuver to do what they can on the tax policy front. Technically, these aspects are dealt with very simply by adding fixed effects in our estimations. It doesn't mean that it's not relevant in the discussion of our results, and that's something that we may factor in a revision. But it's something that is somehow accounted for in our econometric work. Let me just say that, of course, as Sanjeev was saying, linking tax reforms with the expenditure side to it and how it's spent, I mean, it's the two sides of the same coin, and so we have actually control for that, and also try to test for non-linear aspects of tax reforms on different income distribution proxies or macroeconomic variables, accounting exactly for the size of the government. And you can think about the dimension of spending as being one of that proxies. And then I think maybe the last point I would mention that Yaw was referring to on political considerations. Of course, we haven't tested explicitly the parliamentary regime. If it's a presidential regime and you have a set of fixed mandates that you are able to run, And of course, this creates a different set of incentives for you to support or be less supportive of some set of measures on the tax front. We can try to see to what extent we can incorporate this in our analysis, but of course, it's a good point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zhao, for your clarifications. Let me now turn to some questions which have come from the audience. One question which has come from a couple of people is that of what is the feasibility of sort of implementing health taxes? What is the political feasibility of doing so? Because it's seen as a win-win situation. And so I think Chiara mentioned about it in her presentation. So I will leave this to anybody who wants to talk about it. But this is one question. The other one is, what can one do to generate consensus in favor of tax reforms in countries? And the third one is, what can the countries do themselves to implement reforms, and how can the policies of international organizations be changed to help countries implement reforms? What changes are needed in the policies that international institutions are advocating? So these are 4 or 5 questions, and I will start with Catherine first, and then
I think
okay.
I can't hear you.
Okay, so we have only 8 minutes, and so we'll have 2 minutes each per panelist. And so could you please respond to any of those questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. I'll take just my 2 minutes and try not to go over. I think there's scope for some taxes that affect health. Several countries we're working on are considering excise taxes on sugary drinks, for example, also raising excise tax rates on cigarettes and alcohol. And I think these are very feasible policies. Often those excise tax rates on alcohol and tobacco are low. So there's scope for strengthening that, and certainly introducing taxes on sugary drinks and other foodstuffs that are not healthy. So there is scope for that, and we work with the countries on that quite actively. On what can we do to promote consensus? I think we've started to do more on helping countries put together medium-term plans for tax reform. We call them medium-term revenue strategies, but they can be just called medium-term strategies, in which we work with governments to have more explicit plans on tax reform and strengthening of their revenue agencies over a 4 to 6 year period. This is something quite new that countries had not really done before. And I think it's tough. It's a tough order, but it's helping them put on paper what are their real reform plans over the next 4 to 6 years. And having these documents, preparing them and discussing them with different sectors in the government, in civil society, with the legislature, I think is going to be helpful in conveying what the government's tax reform objectives are, how they're linked to spending and contribute to broader goals such as the SDGs, and also have much more of a more concrete dialogue and point of departure. So those are some of the things that we're working with fund member countries on, and I should say in close coordination with the World Bank and other development partners who are also working on tax reform.
Thank you, Catherine, for sticking to 2 minute limit. Elliot, would you?
Thank you, Sanjeev. I have to agree with every word Catherine said about the promoting of consensus. I think that's critically important. But it's not just one or the other, it's all of them. And I think that surely can help carry forward this aspect of building consensus. On the question of what countries can do to influence the policies of international institutions, I think it would be helpful if countries, developing countries in particular, could come together within their own fora. these might be regional associations or even up at the UN potentially, and articulate what their primary concerns are with regard to the taxing authority that they have and with regard to the overall system within which they carry out their tax policies, and to articulate where the tax system that they operate within falls short of meeting their requirements. Now, this is not to say that this is going to get international institutions to fundamentally change all of their tax policies or all of the way in which they support tax policies, but it will, I think, highlight some of the perhaps unanticipated effects that these approaches can have going forward. Now, Chiara mentioned in the context of the last global crisis that we found some countries that are only now starting to get back to the pre-crisis levels of tax and tax to GDP ratios. From our analysis, a lot of that has to do with the premature imposition of fiscal austerity. We face exactly the same problem this time, and that's a dialogue that has to happen. Now, of course, we have far less room for maneuver this time around than we did 10 years ago, but I do think it's important that that those trade-offs be part of the discussion with the international institutions, and that there be a willingness on the part of all parties to think in really innovative ways about how we can circumvent some of these traditional approaches to tax policies and to revenue mobilization, fiscal austerity, so that we don't commit the same mistake as we did 10 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot. Can we now go to Chiara if you would like to pick up any of these questions?
Sanjeev, thank you. And without sort of building on what Elliot and Catherine have said, I think it's, yes, the sequencing and the timing now of the rescue phase of the crisis versus the recovery phase, it's very important. And I think it cannot be the international organization dictating it. I think, yes, there has to be a strong government vision expressed in this regard. We can help, but I think it's important that this is driven by the countries. And I think what we certainly are focusing on right now is much more focusing on base, so the tax base, assessing what tax expenditures are, what are the subsidies that can be removed. Yes, it's politically sensitive, I agree. And that's why the consensus that Catherine was talking about, the broad consensus, is important. But certainly it's not politically a moment to raise tax rates. It's much more to broaden the base. And that's why I also raised these points of looking also at other taxes that have positive externalities, like the health taxes, and increasingly more also the subsidies to fuels that are actually massive amount of resources that are detracted from public spending. Over to you, Sanjeev. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chiara. You have the final word. You can build on what others said, or you can add something else. We have 2 more minutes left, so go ahead.
Thank you. I agree with everybody. I mean, what everybody has said. Consensus is obviously very important. But I think a consensus requires, at least in my view, 3 reinforcing areas of action. One, and again, I mentioned this, is expenditure transparency. People need to know where their taxpayers are going. I mean, their tax revenues are going if you're going to ask them to pay more. And they need to be convinced that their money is being used in a way that benefits them. Otherwise, you're not going to have consensus. So that's very important. Secondly, I think expenditures should focus really in areas that promote growth, because as I think so even part of your papers, I mean, people are much more willing to pay taxes if their income are expanding. And there's a much more willingness to do that. And so if the taxes are helping the economy grow and people are getting more in their pocket, there's more chance of a consensus to pay more. And thirdly, really enforcing, I think, a very innovative and aggressive use of digitization to increase transparency. and of course, as well as our administration, will help in again to build the consensus that's required. So transparency in expenditure, growth promoting expenditure, and then using the digitalization to again reinforce the transparency in this administration will all help bring about the consensus that's needed to support tax reform.
Thank you, Yaa, and thank you all the panelists. I think the discussion was really interesting, and I appreciate the presentation done by Zhao, who laid out some of the issues. Of course, when you're doing this cross-country analysis, some of the finer points that you brought out in the discussion don't really come out that clearly. But I think there were some very interesting and relevant points which were raised by all of you. I think there are external considerations to tax policy reforms, and tax policy reforms are not necessarily all revenue raising. They also can be revenue neutral, or they may lead to a reduction in tax revenues but improve efficiency. And that was in the sample, but when we were looking only at the positive sign, but they are very much in the data set. But I think they are very interesting issues, and I appreciate the point that was raised by Yaa on exemptions granted to donors. This is an issue which UN has been talking about, and it's an issue which I think needs a lot more attention than it has received so far. And it is critical for some of the low-income countries which are losing their revenues, and not enough is being done in this area. With these remarks, I'd like to conclude and say thank you so much to the panelists and to Zhao for this very, very interesting discussion. Thank you. Bye.